very, very kind words. Bates College is indeed in Lewiston, Maine, a place which rivals Michigan for the amount of snow it gets. And Bates is very proud of never canceling classes, no matter how awful the weather. But the administrators of the school like to point out that up until 1963, when the classes were canceled on the assassination of President Kennedy, the only previous time they had been canceled was on the assassination of President Lincoln, which I think ties into the ethos of the school that you mentioned. Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming, especially people who know nothing about international law and are kind of boldly venturing into a territory of foreign jargon. I'm going to talk today about the role of the United Nations Security Council in shaping law related to non-international armed conflicts. And non-international armed conflicts is a rather cumbersome phrase. It's one that's used widely in international law, and it is used to distinguish conflicts that are largely, although not necessarily occur exclusively, within the territory of a single state. You would also generally refer to these as civil wars. And this is to distinguish those internal conflicts from those that occur between states. I will try, and this is a caveat for the international lawyers in the room, I'm going to try not to use the term law of armed conflict to describe the norms of... So this is a new phone. I started recording my... Okay, I'll take it out of my pocket. One of the strangest things that's ever happened in a public place. I'm not going to use the term law of armed conflict because among international lawyers that phrase denotes a very specific body of law related to how armed conflict is carried out. It's often also referred to as humanitarian law, also referred to as the law of war. There will be a little bit of that in the talk, but that is not the body of law that I'm going to talk about. Well, why talk about the role of the Security Council in non-international armed conflicts? Well, really the genesis of this project, and I'll describe the nature of the project and describe the methodology in a moment, came from kind of 4 observations that my co-authors and I noticed in working on a variety of different topics. And obviously, I can't claim credit for everything that I'm going to say because I have 2 very able co-authors on this project. The first thing that we noticed, and this is a fairly straightforward observation, is that under the United Nations Charter, the UN Security Council has the power to impose binding legal obligations on parties that it addresses. And you have here Articles 24.1 and 25 of the UN Charter, which say that the members of the United Nations confer on the Security Council primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and agree that carrying out its duties under this responsibility, the Security Council acts on their behalf. Article 25 says the members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present charter. Essentially, what these 2 provisions mean is that the members of the United Nations have designated the Security Council as their agent to speak on their behalf on matters of international peace and security. And when the Security Council does so, they agree to carry out the dictates, mandates, obligations that it imposes. This is a very far-reaching power. And Article 103 of the Charter makes clear how far-reaching it is. Article 103 provides that in the event of a conflict between an obligation under the UN Charter, keep in mind, the Security Council can impose obligations under the Charter, that's what 24 and 25 say, those obligations prevail over any other treaty obligations that the members of the United Nations may have. So if the Security Council wants to override an existing treaty that everybody is assuming, organizes their affairs, the Security Council has the authority to do so. Now, I'm speaking in very general terms here. There are limitations on these powers that I have mentioned, and I'm happy to talk about those. But in very broad brush terms, the Security Council has this capacity to impose binding obligations that I think it's fair to say no other body in the world does in regard to anything that involves international peace and security. So that was the first observation. The second observation is that some of the obligations that the Security Council has imposed have changed pre-existing international law. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about Security Council resolutions, and just to make clear at the outset, the way in which the Council imposes these obligations is generally through a resolution that requires a majority and also requires that none of the 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, Britain, China, and France, cast a veto. If permanent members want to abstain, that's fine, that doesn't block a resolution, but they can't vote against it. These are just 3 examples out of many. The first example has to do with the human rights obligations of non-state actors. In the context of non-international armed conflicts, in general, one party is almost always a non-state actor. The best example is a civil war between the government and a rebel movement, right? The government, the agent of the state, has human rights obligations. That's pretty clear. But it's quite a controversial question in international law as to whether the other party to that conflict, a rebel group, has any obligations under human rights treaties, or even customary international law. Human rights treaties, by their terms, are open only to states. So there would seem to be kind of a category question about whether these non-state rebel groups can have human rights obligations. And as I'm sure you know, human rights are frequently and egregiously violated in the course of non-international armed conflicts. So it's an uncertain question in international law, and many international lawyers would answer the question in the negative, that in fact they don't have human rights obligations. Well, that hasn't stopped the Security Council, which in resolution after resolution after resolution has called on non-state parties to uphold human rights of people within the territories. Second example, piracy off of Somalia. I think, if you go back 20 years, most people would think that piracy was only something you saw in movies, but we have started to experience piracy again off the Horn of Africa. Piracy in international law is defined as acts that occur on the high seas. And the Security Council, in a series of resolutions, has authorized states that are, and their navies that are trying to combat piracy to capture Somali vessels that commit acts of piracy within Somali territorial waters. Under general international law, by definition, that is not an act of piracy, but the Security Council has essentially made it an act of piracy, and this is something that's happened quite frequently. Final example, the end of the Iraq occupation. So the United States and the UK, after the invasion in 2003, ran Iraq as occupying powers for about 14 months. There is a body of international law, and this is the law of armed conflict, that tells us when occupations start and when they end, and it's a fact-based set of questions. When do the occupying powers assert effective control over the occupied territory, and then when do they relinquish effective control? The Security Council, in a resolution passed in early 2004, said the occupation is going to end on June 30th, 2004. Regardless of what the facts are on the ground, that is when the occupation ends, and full sovereignty and full sovereign authority is returned to indigenous Iraqi authorities. That again is different from from what background international law would provide. Okay, so as I said, these are just 3 examples out of many. The Security Council exercises this authority that I mentioned to change background international law. Third observation is that the Security Council is involved in almost every non-international armed conflict that we see today. Now, what I mean by involved is that it passes resolutions. And our data, which I'll talk about in a moment, shows that if you're looking at conflicts that start after 1990, and 1990 is an important kind of point of demarcation because during the Cold War, the Security Council was essentially paralyzed, but after that, it really starts to get incredibly active. If you look at non-international armed conflicts starting after this period, the Council has passed 1 or more resolutions on 90% of them. So the Council is kind of omnipresent. The fourth observation, which I can't really demonstrate in the PowerPoint slide, is that if you look at standard treatises, kind of any sort of scholarly analysis, even most primary sources of international law, virtually nobody mentions the Security Council. And this struck us as rather strange. If the Council is involved in almost every armed conflict, and it is using its power in some instance to change background international law, you can't understand the law related to non-international armed conflicts without figuring out what the Security Council has said on a particular set of issues. Perhaps more importantly, if the Security Council has, over time, continually changed background international law in a way that looks like a regular pattern, shouldn't that have some effect on that background international law? Shouldn't it be taken into account as something international lawyers would describe as a source of international law? Kind of taking these observations, we decided to investigate. And really, the project seeks to answer 2 questions. The first is a data question. Has the Security Council, in fact, imposed obligations on parties to NIACs, I'll use the acronym, in a regular way, in a way that demonstrates patterns, in a way that demonstrates that the Council believes that a consistent set of norms should apply to non-international armed conflicts? That's the first question. The second question is, assuming that we can find those patterns, how should we understand them? How should we conceptualize them in the scheme of sources of international law that international lawyers regularly consult? As I mentioned, this is not a source that regularly figures in to discussions related to NIACs. And so, to a certain extent, this was new territory. So what I'd like to do is describe for you the methodology that we use to acquire this data, describe some general findings, and then focus on one example of how we believe the Security Council has in fact been changing international law on a regular basis, which will kind of serve as an example of other areas where we found this. And then finally, if we have time, and I really want to leave time for questions, I'll talk about how this data might fit into existing sources of or evidence of international law. Okay, so quickly on the data set. We shamelessly piggybacked on a data collection of information about armed conflict put together by the Uppsala University in Sweden, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program that collects information about death tolls in armed conflicts all over the world. This is a very widely cited source, mostly on the part of political scientists who study the quantitative aspects of armed conflict. So if you have any problems with the underlying data, please write to Uppsala. Don't bug me about it. How do we define an armed conflict? That's obviously an important question. We set a fairly high threshold, at least 1,000 battle-related deaths in at least one conflict year. So just kind of two things about that. First, 1,000 might seem to be high. Uppsala starts with 25, and so there are quite a few conflicts that are not captured by our data set. But our reason for setting it high, and if 1,000 is not random, it's the threshold that Uppsala defines as war. That's a non-legal term, it's just one that they use. The reason for setting it high is that the Security Council in general does not get involved in what it regards as minor or kind of lower level armed conflicts. And so if we set the fatality rate too low, we get a lot of false negatives. That is, it would appear that the Security Council is absent from lots of conflicts when there was never any chance the Security Council would get involved in those conflicts in the first place. So that's 1,000. Second, battle-related deaths. That's in contrast to battlefield deaths. Battlefield deaths obviously captures only combatants. Battle-related brings in civilians. And because we're focusing exclusively on non-international armed conflicts, which occur, within civilian populations, soldiers and combatants and civilians are often intermixed. And in many of these conflicts, the civilian death toll is higher than the combatant death toll. It seemed appropriate to broaden it out that way. So if you look at all of the conflicts that Uppsala lists from 1990 to the end of 2013 using this 1,000 battle-related deaths threshold, you get 63 total conflicts. Of those, 56 are non-international armed conflicts, kind of confirming an observation that many people make in the literature that the overwhelming number of conflicts in the contemporary era are internal as opposed to interstate. And the total number of Security Council resolutions passed on those conflicts is 1257. So we enlisted a dedicated team of law students who read every single one of those resolutions and they coded them for reference to a list of legal issues that we thought might yield some interesting results, and they're very, very broad, and I won't list all of them. Where do we go here? Yes, just one more thing on the data. The Security Council sometimes imposes obligations, but often it just exhorts parties to do something. Sometimes it observes, sometimes it thanks parties. It does lots of things in its resolutions that don't involve binding obligations. And so it was important for us when we found reference to, say, the human rights obligations of non-state actors, to distinguish the council binding those actors, in using its authority under the UN Charter, from simply, calling on them or suggesting that they abide by human rights obligations. There are some fairly clear indicators in the UN Charter about when the Security Council is acting in kind of binding mode. The most clear is when it invokes Chapter 7 of the Charter. I'm happy to talk about this at greater length, but Chapter 7 is the portion of the Charter that allows the Security Council to use force or authorize force, and it's generally accepted that when the Council invokes Chapter 7, it's in binding mode. Similarly, if it refers to Articles 25, which I quoted cited at the very beginning, or Article 48, which have similar language, we coded those as binding, and then we looked for certain terms, and this is a little bit squishier, but this is, again, as I said, kind of fairly new territory. When the Council used certain terms to introduce the language in a resolution, we coded those as binding. So Security Council resolutions have numbered paragraphs, and each numbered paragraph begins with a verb, and there are certain verbs that are generally understood to impose binding obligations, and we consulted people at the UN Secretariat and various national missions to the UN, people in the US State Department, kind of vetted this list with them, and everybody pretty much signed off on these terms. So those are the situations in which we coded a council action as binding. That was one category of coding. Another category was non-binding. Council is clearly just doing something without any expectation that it might be done. And then there's a kind of middle category where it's kind of unclear whether the council was imposing binding obligations or not. It might be binding, it might not. Security Council resolutions are politically negotiated documents. Sometimes the language is the result of compromise that is deliberately ambiguous, so we couldn't be clear. So that goes into the middle category. All right. I think that's all I want to say about the methodology. I'm happy to talk about it a little bit more in questions. So what did we find? Well, we first found, as I mentioned before, that the overwhelming percentage of conflicts are non-international as opposed to international. And as I had showed in a previous slide, that the Security Council has passed at least one resolution with a binding obligation on 90% of conflicts starting after 1990. Now, perhaps you are thinking, well, maybe that was true up through 2013, but haven't there been a number of high-profile conflicts since then, but some that might have started even before 2013, where the Security Council has been notably absent. And the two that are discussed most often are Syria and Ukraine. The first thing to say about that is that Ukraine, Russian protestations to the contrary, is probably almost certainly not an internal armed conflict, so it wouldn't even come into our data set. And Syria, obviously, is one where the Council has largely, although not completely, been absent. But I think the interesting part of our data is that that sort of political gridlock that makes the Council unable to engage with a conflict that is truly horrible is something of an outlier. In 90% of NIACs that meet our definition, the Council has in fact been able to pass resolutions, and in many cases pass quite a few resolutions. Anecdotally, sure, Syria is important, and I think many would regard it as a failure on the part of the Council, but I wouldn't regard it as typical. Okay, let's go back to where I was before. How has the Security Council changed international law? Let me say first that we didn't find changes in all areas. There are many areas of law and human rights is a good example where the Council, it simply affirms existing law. So the Council often calls on states and state officials to adhere to human rights treaty obligations. There's nothing controversial about that. The Council is simply kind of repeating obligations that everybody understands are already there. So I don't want to give the impression that across the board the Council has engaged in lawmaking. But in some areas it has. So for example, creating or enhancing democratic institutions. One of the areas the Council started to become involved in after 1990 in a very substantial way was the reconstruction of post-conflict states. When states are engaged in civil wars, political institutions often cease to function or function only intermittently. There's enormous damage to the national infrastructure. The country is obviously polarized. It's a big chore to bring the country back to a peacetime footing and take groups of people who have been killing each other for a substantial period of time and convince them that it's worth participating in and taking seriously new political institutions that are created after the end of armed conflict. And the Council has authorized a large number of peacekeeping missions and other sorts of endeavors to try and address those problems in post-conflict states. One of the themes that comes up consistently in those resolutions is the importance of democratic institutions. These most obviously relate to elections, but they also relate to institutionalizing human rights protections, institutionalizing protections for minority groups, ensuring the inclusion of women. It's not clear, I think, from background international law that post-conflict states as a package need to take all of these steps. But the Council has consistently required them to do so. And here's a range of findings. The lowest is from non-international armed conflicts that began prior to 1990. Then all NIACs post-1990, then substantially higher if you look at resolutions in which Chapter 7 is invoked, that's pre-1990, and then the highest in post-1990 conflicts where Chapter 7 was invoked. Another example, the one I just mentioned, non-state actors ordered to respect human rights. If you take the highest category, again in red, post-1990 conflicts in which Chapter 7 is invoked, in 86% of those conflicts, non-state actors, not generally understood to have human rights obligations, are nonetheless ordered to respect human rights. So those are just a couple of examples. I want to focus on one in particular to kind of walk you through how Council obligations differ from background international law, and this is the example of peace agreements that end NIACs. It is very common that internal armed conflicts nowadays will end with some sort of peace agreement. It's also quite common that the United Nations, usually through an envoy appointed by the Secretary General, will be involved in the negotiation of those agreements. Let me, just in the interest of time, skip forward a little bit. What is the traditional kind of background understanding of the status of those agreements? Are they treaties, which are understood as binding instruments containing binding obligations, or are they something else? This is what generally accepted international law says. You go to a treaty called the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. It's the treaty about treaties. Not surprisingly, the treaty about treaties starts by defining a treaty. A treaty means an international agreement concluded between states. So you need state parties on both sides. By definition, an agreement concluding a NIAC does not have state parties on both sides, right? It's an agreement between one or more rebel forces and the government representing the state. So those sorts of agreements don't meet the definition in Article 2. Does that mean that they can never be treaties? Well, no. If you read on in Article 3 of the Vienna Convention, it says, the fact that the present convention does not apply to international agreements concluded between states and other subjects of international law, or between other subjects of international law, or to international agreements not in written form, shall not affect the legal force of such agreements. So, if the non-state party to an agreement is a quote-unquote subject of international law, then this definition in Article 2 doesn't preclude that agreement from being considered a treaty and containing binding obligations on those on the parties to it. Okay, so are rebel groups subjects of international law? There we have a case about this. It involved the Lomé Agreement ending the civil war in Sierra Leone. There was that peace agreement contained an amnesty provision. There was and still is an international criminal tribunal, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, that was set up in an agreement between Sierra Leone and the United Nations. And the question of whether that amnesty had effect came up before the court. And because the amnesty was embedded in this peace agreement, which had a rebel movement as one of the parties, the question arose whether it was binding or not. And the Special Court for Sierra Leone says no. The RUF, which was the rebel group in Sierra Leone, had no treaty-making capacity so as to make the Lomé Agreement into an international agreement. So the answer going back to here is that the rebel movement is not a subject of international law, therefore this is not a treaty. Okay, that's one perspective. Immediately after this decision comes down, Antonio Casese, one of the kind of great scholarly authorities on international criminal law, writes this scathing article saying the Sierra Leone tribunal got it all wrong. If the RUF had effective control over a portion of Sierra Leone, that, in his view, gave them sufficient legal status to be able to enter into a treaty. When Antonio Casese says something about international criminal law or even law of treaties, it's a statement to take seriously. Not long after that, Christine Bell of the University of Edinburgh writes a very widely cited article about peace agreements in general, focusing quite a bit on peace agreements that end NIACs. And she says, these agreements don't fit into any existing legal categories. We just simply can't be sure. So you have a debate, uncertainty in international law about the status of these peace agreements. And these are important. The peace agreements essentially are blueprints for how the post-conflict states are going to walk this very difficult road to what you might call political normalcy. They provide for peacekeeping agreements, they provide for elections, they provide for the demobilization of combatants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If the peace agreements can be ignored, perhaps because they aren't understood as binding, that will be a big deal for the future of post-conflict states. All right, so we have general uncertainty. What has the Security Council done? Overwhelmingly, the Security Council treats these agreements as binding. They order parties to adhere to them. They criticize parties for not adhering to them. And in some cases, they impose sanctions, mostly on the non-state parties for failing to adhere to their obligations. And the language that the Security Council uses in these resolutions is really the language of binding obligation. Here's an example from a 2003 resolution on Liberia. The Security Council, acting under Chapter 7, as you see, demands that the Liberian party cease hostilities throughout Liberia and fulfill their obligations under the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and Ceasefire Agreement, et cetera. The Security Council has done this a lot. Here is a list of the resolutions grouped by conflict in which the Security Council has demanded that non-state parties adhere to peace agreements. I could talk about any one of these conflicts. I just wanted to give you a sense of how broad the Security Council practice is. So this is kind of a little case study of the type of analysis we're going to go through. It's 10 after 1, so let me just say a few words about the second question, which is how we take this data, and let's assume that we have more than one area that's like the NIAC peace agreements, in which we see that the Council deviating from existing international law. How is that conceptualized? To the extent scholars have kind of looked into this question, they have made arguments about how Council practice might be viewed as evidence of customary international law. And customary international law, this is the definition that's in the statute of the International Court of Justice, is evidence of a general practice accepted as law. It's generally understood as state practice, and practice that has a subjective mental component. That is, this is not just something that states do regularly, but something that they view as being done pursuant to a legal obligation. How would we conceptualize Security Council practice as fitting into custom? I think maybe what I'll do is just list some potential problems with this categorization, and we can talk about it in discussion rather than try and provide answers. Well, actually, maybe I'll start with the pro case and then go to the anti case. The pro case is I think evident from one of the first slides that I put up, that under the UN Charter, every member of the United Nations, which is now every country in the world, delegates to the Security Council the authority to speak on their behalf in regard to peace and security measures, and agrees to accept what the Council does. So, you know, what better evidence could you have of customary international law? The Council is speaking on behalf of everybody, and everybody agrees to accept what the Council says. Isn't that important? You know, what other questions would you ask? Okay, well, here's some questions. First, the practice that is almost always looked at and cited in support of customary international law is state practice. That is, the practice of individual states. What do states do? What do they say? How do they act? It is quite a controversial thing to look at the practice of international organizations as contributing to state practice. And you know, critics of the kind of agency theory that I mentioned would say, well, certainly as a kind of matter of as a legal fiction, of course, states you know, delegate this authority to the Council. But we don't have any actual evidence about whether states agree with the Council in all of these instances where it's imposing obligations. They may disagree, but you know, they look at the UN Charter and say, well, really, there's nothing we can do about this. We have, when we joined the UN, we signed on to agreeing to what the Council says. Okay, so that's one criticism. A second criticism is that the Council really isn't a legal body. It's a political body. Its decisions originate in the political interests of the member states, most importantly the political interests of the Permanent Five. And when the Council formulates resolutions, it is not acting like a court or acting like a conference that creates a treaty text, or even acting like an individual state that ratifies a treaty. It is seeking a political objective. And the political objective in NIACs is to end the fighting and bring peace to the territory. And that is done in the language of obligation because the Council wants the parties to listen, but it's not purporting to make law. Third problem, and this in many ways I think is perhaps the most kind of intellectually puzzling. All of the resolutions that feed into our data are conflict specific, right? They speak to the actions of particular parties at particular times in particular conflicts. Once the parties fulfill what the Council has asked them to do, or the conflict is over, presumably those resolutions expire. They have no more lasting effect. Perhaps more importantly, they were not intended to have any lasting effect, right? They're instrumental. So if we have a series of very specific obligations. How can we say that the council, and these obligations are retrospective, right? They are looking at what has happened and trying to remedy action that the council believes in some way is bad or wrong or injurious to people of the country. How can we take those conflict-specific resolutions and elevate them to international norms, which are by their nature prospective? That is, they are trying to shape state and perhaps even non-state conduct in the future. To say, if you transgress, say, a peace agreement ending a NIAC, then you have violated international law. Critics would say that's not at all what these resolutions were intended to do. So let me stop there. I've probably gone on too long, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes?
Thanks, Craig. It sounds really interesting, and I just kind of want to continue on right where you left off. Is there any evidence of state practice saying, okay, well, the Security Council said this in another context, but you're setting a norm that we are somehow bound by?
There's something I skipped over in the presentation, but it's relevant to your question. So the council has actually passed 3 resolutions, and I think I even have a slide on these. Yeah, okay. 3 resolutions that are very clearly lawmaking. And you know, there's now like a room full of literature on Security Council legislating. This is what they're talking about. They're talking about resolutions that look like treaties, that say, for example, the resolution in 2001 passed right after 9/11, saying that states have to cut off funds to terrorist groups. Then there's another one on WMD proliferation, and then a more recent one on foreign fighters following the rise of ISIS. These are, as I said, look like treaty texts. Their terms are phrased very broadly. They're phrased prospectively. And if you read the council debates, it's pretty clear the council is just saying everybody has to conform to this. And there are a lot of states that object, but they object to the fact that the Security Council is basically taking the process of treaty making and appropriating it for its own use. So states recognize that in this context, the Security Council clearly has the power to impose prospective obligations. But what about the resolutions that are in our database? That evidence is very hard to come by. Maybe 2 places where that information that conclusion can be drawn. The first is that the council, as our data shows, tends to use the same template over and over again when it works. And again, looking at the debates over the particular resolutions, member states will often say, we made sure that state part. I'm just making this up, but it's things like this. We made sure that in these past conflicts, the state, the rebel groups adhered to their obligations under the peace agreements. That was really important, and we're going to do that again. So you see that enough, and it seems to be understood as a generally accepted way of approaching the problem. There is not in those debates language saying we believe that this council action has changed international law, but you wouldn't expect states, what they say in the Security Council is very heavily edited by foreign ministries. They wouldn't say something like that. Let me just say one other thing that occurs to me, which is that we are not making the claim, although I suppose somebody might based on the data, that council action on its own has changed international law. It's very rare that a specific set of actions will on their own alter pre-existing customary law. It usually requires a lot more action over time. So we're trying to make a more modest claim, which is that this is practice that should be taken into account and it shouldn't be ignored, which is what people have been doing up to. Yes, question.
Thanks. I think the empirical data is going to make a major contribution to the literature, so it's fantastic. I wonder though, when you get beyond the empirical data and start making a normative claim, however modest, that you're not in danger of calcifying, in a sense, Security Council practice, and in turn, providing a disincentive for members of the Security Council to pass resolutions on specific solutions to specific problems. If, for example, you want to draw a general principle that parties to an agreement in ending a civil war should abide by their agreements, then you could get into dodgy practice whereby a general amnesty is provided for in a peace agreement. And you don't necessarily want the parties abiding by that agreement. You want people to be prosecuted, for example.
Right.
So would Security Council members potentially be concerned that they will establish precedents if we go beyond the empirical data and make a normative claim that this might contribute to a new law of internal armed conflict?
Yeah, I suppose that is a possible danger. I guess maybe I could say a couple of things. The first is, I don't think that danger of kind of calcifying practice, which that's the glass half empty way of looking at it. The other way is codifying accepted practice. That happening in regard to the Security Council is no different from seeing a customary norm emerge in any other context. And if states in general suddenly realize that a customary norm that's emerging or has emerged, or some court has pronounced as finally arrived is somehow wrong, they could deviate from that. So I don't think we're claiming anything that's different from the way customary law is made generally. The second thing is, the council can always change its mind for particular conflicts. And if it wanted to pass a resolution saying, this particular peace agreement is not binding, it could do that. Or if, they read our article and say, my God, I didn't realize I was actually making international law, this has to stop. There are resolutions that are kind of scattered around where the council says, none of the obligations imposed in this resolution shall be deemed to have an effect on customary international law, which we're going to kind of cite as actually evidence for our thesis, because why would they say that if they didn't think that there might be an effect on customary international law? But if they want to, kind of opt out, they want to exclude this particular conflict or this particular category, or just reverse a particular practice, they have the legislative fiat to be able to do that. Yes?
The Republicans for a long time have been running, trying to dissolve the UN. I'm not sure if Donald Trump has actually said he would dissolve the UN, but he's made statements that point in that direction. I think maybe the Israel-Palestine conflict, people are predicting that if Donald Trump wins election, that Obama might, as one of his last things in office, recognize Palestine, and how that would play out in the international law of the UN, if Palestine was actually a state entity as opposed to a non-state entity.
Well, I mean, regardless of Palestine's status, the United States would still retain its veto in the Security Council, and so the U.S. has used that veto quite regularly to stop resolutions related to Israel-Palestine, and I would imagine the U.S. would continue to do that.
But still, the highest percent of all resolutions in the Security Council is related to Israel-Palestine?
No. I think you might be thinking of the Human Rights Commission or perhaps the General Assembly, but not. There are actually very few Security Council resolutions on Israel-Palestine. Yes? Yes, you.
So you mentioned Syria as an exceptional case,
Yes.
but I wonder if you looked at the 5 or 6 cases that make up the 10% in which there are no resolutions, because I think that would be, I'd almost be more interested to know what is it that those cases share that makes it that they don't get these
That's
obligations?
a really interesting question, and we're still kind of working through that. So
Who are these people?
who are these people? So if you're looking at the conflicts in which the council has been most active, that is conflicts, NIACs that started after 1990, and there are 15 of those. And the ones in which the Security Council passed no resolutions are the Algerian Civil War, the conflict in Congo-Brazzaville, not DR Congo, and the Boko Haram conflict in Nigeria. So those are the three out of 15. I can't say that there's any kind of common thread. I can give you reasons why, kind of looking at the material related to those conflicts, why it seems the council didn't pass resolutions. On two of the, but I think the most important thing I can say about those conflicts related to our project is that it doesn't look like the reasons for council abstention had anything to do with the normative obligations that we're focusing on. That is, the council didn't abstain from the Algeria conflict because they were uncertain whether it would be a good idea to denominate a peace agreement in that conflict as binding. The reasons are all over the map, but none of them really relate to the normative issues. And so, for example, in Algeria, the Western members of the Security Council. So this was so in Algeria in 1990 there were the first free elections in a very long time. A Islamist party called the Islamic Salvation Front won an overwhelming majority, so overwhelming that they had the capacity to amend the Algerian constitution, and there were lots of statements by members of the Islamic Salvation Front during the campaign that this was essentially going to be the last election, that they were going to turn Algeria into an Islamic state. I'm grossly overstating this, but the Western members got very nervous. And so after the elections, the Algerian military essentially nullified the results and took over the country, and the result was then 10 or 12 years of really horrible civil war. The Western members sided with the Algerian military in that conflict. They were not going to try and stop it in a way that might legitimize the Islamic Salvation Front. Another important reason in that conflict is that the Algerian government itself resisted external involvement in every way. Kofi Annan made some overtures trying to send a special representative to negotiate a peace agreement, and the Algerian government said no. So there was both kind of external reluctance and internal resistance. Congo-Brazza, I could go through the details of each of those, but it's hard to find a common thread, but I don't think that the reasons for abstention had an impact on our hypothesis. Brad, yes?
There's a subset of the norms at issue here of particular significance to me, the idea of some sort of emergent internal, sort of use ad bellum of internal conflict, which has been absent from international law. So international law establishes that the territorial independence, integrity and political independence of states is sacrosanct, and that becomes the basis for an international norm on the recourse to force, which as clearly establishes what cannot be done and when it's done, who is in the wrong, and therefore it sort of takes sides internationally with respect to armed conflict. In internal armed conflict, that has not existed, and I would argue it hasn't existed not because international law hasn't gotten around to it, but because if international law were to bear on this, this would affect a massive transformation in the whole way in which the international community is conceptualized. And I'm wondering to what extent your project embodies some kind of thesis that now we're going to basically have an international law on the use of force internally. That we're going to find in this a guideline to who the good guys and who the bad guys are in civil conflict.
Okay, so Brad has had the misfortune of actually reading a draft of the article. Is quite familiar with this aspect of it. Let me just explain the issue that he's alluding to. So, again, generalizing quite a bit. The UN Charter in Article 2.4 prohibits the aggressive use of force by states against the territorial integrity or political independence of other states. That's, kind of about as fundamental a norm in international law as you can get. By contrast, international law says, you would probably say nothing, I might say virtually nothing, about the legitimacy of parties within states using force. In other words, it doesn't say to governments, you can't put down a rebellion, and it doesn't say to rebel groups, you can't try and oust your government. That's a matter for the citizens of a state to decide, and international law does not prohibit a bloody conflict. It to a much greater extent than it used to, regulates the conduct of those internal armed conflicts, and an emerging body of humanitarian law tries to kind of create a parity between the conduct that's regulated in international armed conflicts and the conduct in internal armed conflicts. But the idea of regulating the use of force itself, the initial recourse to force in internal conflicts, is something, I think it's, Brad is right, it's something that international law has really never contemplated. What's really interesting is that in every single one of these NIACs that the Council has addressed, they say to the parties, stop fighting. Do it now. You can't resolve your differences by force. It's illegitimate and unacceptable to resort to force to resolve these differences. And the Council, has a whole variety of tools that it uses to try and get parties to stop fighting. What do you do with that? This very consistent practice, saying it is, in our view, illegitimate to resolve internal conflicts by force. We don't want to overclaim, because this is something that, if citation to Security Council practice is rare, any sort of argument about transforming this body of law that applies to international conflicts to internal conflicts is virtually non-existent. There's 2 articles in 1 book that I've found, that's it. But it really does raise a question about whether this kind of complete freedom from external scrutiny is something that is now acceptable. I mean, it used to be the case that every aspect of civil wars was considered off limits to outsiders. But the Security Council, in an area that I haven't talked about, has essentially engaged the entire international community in efforts, not in every conflict, but in some, to resolve those conflicts through sanctions regimes, right? And the Security Council in Resolution 1267 set up a committee that is sent names of people and of organizations who are the target of sanctions, not always as a result of NIACs, but in many cases they are. And every state in the international community is obligated, for example, to freeze assets owned by those people, to deny them the capacity to travel, etc. So what used to be purely an internal affair is now a concern of the entire international community. And I think it at least raises a possibility of the initial recourse to force being subject to international regulation. I mean, why would you be willing to say that everything after the initial recourse to force is fair game for the international community to regulate, but not the initial use of force itself? And in fact, as I said, the Security Council does that every single time. So I don't think we're in a position to claim that this is at all ripened into an international norm that would be, you mentioned a number of really difficult kind of downstream consequences of doing that. But Security Council practice is, taking us in a different direction. Yes?
We see when international law sort of complicated by, let's say, a UN resolution and then a decision by another institution like the ICJ. And I'm sort of alluding to Resolution 1244, where the ICJ basically, says, speaks on the legality of Kosovo as it's neither legal or illegal, it just is. Do we see that when a resolution comes out, that another institution can kind of complicate its perception when it comes to international actors? And my other question is, where is the cutoff between a NIAC and when a NIAC becomes an international armed conflict? Because we see, even in the Syrian civil war, it may have been an internalized conflict.
Right.
Now we see the incursion of Russia and the United States with airstrikes. Where's the cutoff period where we call it a NIAC still?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'll answer that one first. You may think it's a non-answer, but we accept whatever classification UPSALA has. If UPSALA calls it a NIAC, then it's a NIAC. If it's an IAC, it's a NIAC. The people at UPSALA are not international lawyers. They don't base their classification on criteria that might, for example, view Syria as an international armed conflict for purposes of, say, the Geneva Conventions. But that would have added a whole layer of complication. So whatever UPSALA says is good for us. The second question about other international bodies interpreting Security Council resolutions. I guess the first thing to say is that it doesn't happen that often. There are, apart from that Kosovo case you mentioned, there are only a handful of ICJ cases where that becomes kind of a central issue. There is the very famous Kadi decision by the European Court of Human Rights, which was not a interpretation of the Security Council resolution as such, but it was essentially seen as that. So it involved the Sanctions Committee that I mentioned. And one kind of Orwellian aspect of the sanctions regime when it was first set up was that once you got on the sanctions list, it was almost impossible to get off. There was no procedure set up in the Security Council for people who thought that they were mistakenly subject to sanctions, and their lives were basically put in the deep freeze, right? So Kadi, who's, I've forgotten what his nationality was, but 1267 says, to member states, you have to, kind of respect these sanctions. The Council of Europe implements those obligations through regulations. And Kadi brings a case challenging the regulations, and the European Court says this violates your due process rights because your property and your right to travel and everything are being put on hold and you have no recourse. Now that was, as I said, a challenge to the regulations implementing a Security Council resolution, not the resolution itself, but that I think is maybe more form than substance. And a lot of people saw this as a human rights body putting the brakes on the Security Council. Now to its credit, the 1267 process was reformed. There is now a way to get off the list if you think you're mistakenly on. But again, that's very rare. Most of the resolutions that we're talking about, I'm not sure present obligations that would make for a very good case before an international court. It's also, if we're talking about the ICJ, it was a very kind of openly debated question, mostly in the 1990s, as to whether the ICJ could exercise judicial review over the Security Council. That is, could the ICJ act in a sense like the U.S. Supreme Court, saying that the Council had exceeded its powers, acted, to use the legal term, ultra vires. There was one preliminary opinion in a case involving Libya that was fodder for a lot of writing. The Council, the ICJ really hasn't ventured into that territory since then. So I think it's a pretty rare occurrence, and one that may not have a lot of consequence for the resolution too. Yes?
I have one more question. Just because it prompts, you might have said this at the very beginning, but why are you limiting your study the only NIACs? Like, could you not have something with, by looking, maybe it's just a subset, the vast majority of conflicts are NIACs, so you decided to go with that route, but couldn't you have something also being said in Security Council resolutions dealing with IACs that change the ground rules?
Yeah, we absolutely
Okay.
could, and actually the data is on all conflicts. The analysis, so we're just kind of taking the NIACs out and looking at it. The reason is because the council has, I think, in our view, departed from existing international law much more frequently than it has with IACs. You know, and you know, as you know, there is not a symmetry in the you know, kind of extent of international regulation of internal conflicts and external conflicts, and so there's a lot more room for the council to be innovative with IACs, and so we just thought it was a more interesting area to look at. Yes.
Earlier in one of your charts, you identified in the third point, end of occupation as being an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if the Security Council has that defined for the purpose of their involvement in a conflict, or if that's actual some, you know, muscle that they can flex to tell a state, hey, you need to stop.
Yeah, well, they can and they did. Now, whether they can, you know, kind of be effective in saying, you know, after this date you have to leave. I think, as it turned out, in Iraq things were already starting to deteriorate, and so the United States was willing to relinquish authority to domestic Iraqi institutions. You know, the Security Council only has as much authority as, you know, first the permanent members, then the rest of its members, and then the rest of the UN membership is willing to invest in it. So I think, you know, it's difficult for the Council to deviate substantially from what a very powerful member wants to do, or from what the vast majority of members want to do. Although keep in mind that if one of the permanent five, you know, doesn't like something it sees in a draft resolution, it will either veto that resolution or say to the states that are drafting it, look, if this is passed as written, we're going to veto it, so you better take out this thing. So, you know, powerful states kind of exert their influence on council practice in a way that you know, kind of predates the passage of the resolution. Yes?
If you could possibly reinterpret the 90% as actually being low, not high, considering it's already 1,000 threshold, and that actually the fact that only 90% have resolution shows that there is a large legitimacy, like you were saying, that armed struggle is actually legitimate. I mean, you think that if the police only responded to 90% of calls?
Right. That's a really interesting question, and there's, it's one that we've actually struggled with. You know, how high a percentage of involvement is significant or useful? You know, you know, as international lawyers, when you're talking about practice over time, you know, your first thought is about customary law. And the general understanding of customary law is that with, you know, some unusual circumstances accepted, you need most states to sign on, or at least not have significant opposition by, you know, a substantial portion of states, and that the practice has to be maintained over time. You know, I think 90% would probably be okay in, if you're talking about a particular customary norm. But you know, as you saw from some of the charts, you know, some of the percentages that we have aren't. I mean, 90% was the percentage of post-1990 NIACs in which there is at least one resolution. But if you look at particular issues, you know, what percentage of NIACs does the council impose binding obligations? And in some it's only 50%, in some it's lower. I don't want to go into enormous amounts of detail, but methodologically this becomes tricky, because let's take the issue of peace agreements. It might be that you know, you get an overall number, say it's 80%, and you say, well, you know, that's important, but it's significant, but why would the council ignore peace agreements in 20% of the conflicts? That seems like not a uniform practice. But you don't think you can't really take all NIACs as your baseline number, because not all NIACs have peace agreements. And so it really is only useful to ask the question, in what percentage of conflicts in which there is a peace agreement does the Security Council say that those peace agreements are binding? In other words, you can't expect the Council to address an issue that doesn't exist in a particular conflict. And while it's easy in the case of a peace agreement to know whether the issue exists, I mean, there either is a peace agreement or there isn't, it's much harder to know about other issues. For example, the Security Council has said a lot about the targeting of women and children in armed conflicts. Can you say that the issue of women and children being targeted is present in some conflicts but not others? I mean, in every conflict, women and children are targeted to a certain extent. But at what point would you say that it's insignificant enough that the absence of a Security Council resolution couldn't be chalked up to a reluctance to engage with the issue, but rather the Council not engaging with an issue that isn't there, or isn't there to a sufficient degree that it merited mention in a resolution? That's a very difficult question to answer, and I've got to say that we're still working through. Essentially the question is, how do you, what is the baseline? Is it all NIACs, or is it some subset of NIACs in which a particular issue is present? Yes?
Just briefly, are the Security Council meetings closed door? There's no transcript or any record?
Most of them are open, and in fact, you can go on the UN website and get more or less transcripts of the debates. Some of them involve nothing more than a roll call vote on a resolution, because all of the negotiation has been done in private. It's really only where there's some controversy or some dissent that there is a full debate. But there are a very small number of kind of closed door briefings that usually involve sensitive intelligence matters, but virtually all council meetings are open and you can get the meeting transcripts.
Okay, thank you.